When I gave my son everything, I thought I was securing my place in his life. I didn't realize I was signing myself out of it. The key didn't fit. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the front door of the house I had lived in for 32 years, the brass lock gleaming under the late afternoon sun like it had never belonged to me at all. I tried again, slower this time, pressing the key in with careful pressure, turning it the way I had done thousands of times before, but it stopped halfway, stiff and unyielding. Someone had changed the locks. For a second I thought there had to be some mistake. Maybe Daniel had hired someone to fix the door. Maybe they had replaced something and forgotten to tell me. That kind of oversight happens. Families forget things. I told myself that as I stepped back from the door, my hand still wrapped around a key that no longer opened anything. The air felt unusually still, like the entire street was holding its breath. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people waved from their porches and children rode their bikes in slow circles at the end of the cul-de-sac, but now it felt different. Distant. I walked down the short path to the driveway and looked at the house from a distance, trying to see it the way a stranger might. The white siding Daniel had insisted on repainting last spring. The flower beds I had planted every year, now blooming in soft pinks and yellows. The porch swing my husband built with his own hands just months before he passed. Everything was still there. Everything looked exactly the same, except I wasn't inside. I turned back toward the door and knocked, gently at first, then a little louder. The sound echoed in a way I didn't recognize, hollow and sharp. I waited. No footsteps. No movement behind the curtain. I knocked again, this time firm enough that it should have carried through every room. Still nothing. I knew he was home. Daniel's car was in the driveway, parked at the same slight angle he always left it, like he was in too much of a hurry to straighten the wheel. I could see the faint outline of the television flickering through the edge of the living room window. He was inside. He just wasn't opening the door. I stepped back again, my chest tightening in a way that wasn't quite panic, but something colder, more deliberate. A realization that moved slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor. 2 weeks ago I had signed everything over to him. The house. The savings. The small investment account his father and I had built over decades, dollar by careful dollar. It had felt like the right thing to do at the time. I had just buried my husband. 35 years of marriage reduced to a quiet ceremony and a polished wooden box. Daniel had held my hand that day, his voice soft, steady, telling me I didn't need to worry about anything anymore. "I'll take care of you, Mom," he had said. And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. It made the grief easier to carry, knowing I wasn't alone. So when he suggested transferring everything into his name, to make things simpler, I didn't hesitate. I trusted him the way only a mother can trust her child. I gave him everything. And now I was standing outside my own home, holding a useless key, knocking on a door that wasn't meant to open for me anymore. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, staring at his name on the screen for a long second before pressing call. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I wasn't sure what I would even say. Instead, I lowered the phone slowly and looked back at the house, at the curtains that didn't move, at the door that stayed firmly shut. Somewhere inside I knew Daniel was there. Maybe standing just out of sight. Maybe watching. Maybe waiting for me to understand what this moment meant without him having to say a single word. And that was the part that settled deepest. Not the lock. Not the silence. But the certainty that this wasn't an accident. This was a decision. And for the first time since I became a widow, I felt something shift inside me. Something quiet but unbreakable. Like a door closing somewhere deep within that no one would ever be able to unlock again. I did not knock again. There was something about the silence on the other side of that door that told me knocking would not change anything. It was not the kind of silence that comes from an empty house. It was the kind that listens, that waits, that chooses not to respond. I slipped my phone back into my purse and stood there for a few more seconds, letting the reality settle in fully, like dust slowly falling after something has been moved. Then I turned around and walked down the front steps, each one feeling steadier than the last, not because I felt strong, but because I understood that whatever this was, it had already been decided long before I stood there with that key in my hand. I reached the sidewalk and paused, looking back one last time. The curtains in the living room window shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. It was a small movement, but it was enough. He was there. He had been there the whole time. Watching. Waiting for me to leave. I did not wave. I did not call out his name. I simply turned and began walking. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement as I moved down the quiet street, my footsteps soft but deliberate. I had nowhere specific to go, and for the first time in decades that fact did not feel like panic. Felt like something else. Something unfamiliar, but not entirely unwelcome. 2 houses down, Mrs. Carter was watering her front lawn, the gentle arc of water catching the light as it moved back and forth. She glanced up as I approached, her expression shifting from casual recognition to something more hesitant, more careful. "Margaret," she called out, turning off the hose. "Everything all right?" I stopped, offering a small smile that did not quite reach my eyes. "Of course," I said evenly. "Just out for a walk." She nodded slowly, though her gaze flickered past me toward my house, toward the driveway where Daniel's car sat unmoved. People notice things. They always do. They just do not always know what to say about them. "Well," she added gently, "it is a beautiful evening for it." "Yes," I replied. "It is." I continued walking before she could ask anything else, before I had to decide how much truth I was willing to put into words. The air felt cooler as I reached the end of the block, a soft breeze brushing against my face, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass and something distant, something almost like rain. I had not realized how tightly I had been holding my breath until that moment, when I finally exhaled slowly and let my shoulders drop just a fraction. My mind moved back over the past few weeks, not in a rush, but in careful pieces like someone sorting through old photographs. The conversations, the small changes, the way Ashley had started speaking for Daniel more often, answering questions that were never directed at her, the way certain topics would shift the moment I entered the room, the way paperwork had been presented to me not as a request but as a solution, something already decided that I simply needed to agree with. At the time it had all seemed reasonable, practical, even thoughtful. Now, standing on a street that no longer led back to a home that belonged to me, those same moments felt different, sharper, intentional. I reached into my purse again, not for my phone this time, but for the folded set of documents I had carried with me earlier that morning, the copies I had insisted on keeping even when Daniel told me I did not need them. I pulled them out and held them in my hands, the paper slightly warm from the heat of the day. My name was still there, printed clearly at the top of each page, followed by lines of legal language that had seemed so straightforward at the time. Transfer. Authorization. Ownership. Words that sound simple until you understand what they truly take from you. I folded the papers back carefully and returned them to my purse, my movements slow and deliberate. If they thought I had nowhere to go, they were only half right. What I did not have anymore was a place to return to. But what I did have, something they had not considered, was time. Time to think. Time to remember. Time to understand exactly what had been done and, more importantly, what had not been done correctly. Because people who move too quickly, who are too certain of their own plans, often overlook the smallest details. And sometimes it is those details that matter most. I lifted my gaze and continued walking, the rhythm of my steps steady and unhurried, as the sun dipped lower behind the houses and the light softened into something quieter, something more forgiving. Behind me, my house stood exactly where it always had, unchanged to anyone passing by. But I knew the truth now. It was no longer mine. And strangely, that realization did not break me. It clarified something I had not been able to see before. I had not just been locked out of a house. I had been removed from a story that was never meant to include me in the end. And now, for the first time, I was free to decide what came next. The first place I went was not a hotel, and it was not a friend's house. It was the one place I knew would still open its doors to me without questions, without hesitation. The bank. The glass doors slid open with a quiet hum as I stepped inside, the cool air wrapping around me in a way that felt almost grounding. It smelled faintly of paper and polished floors, the same familiar scent it had carried for years. I had walked through those doors countless times with my husband, usually on a Tuesday morning, always together, always with a purpose that felt shared. Today I walked in alone, and for the first time I understood that I was not here out of routine. I was here because something inside me had begun to ask questions I could no longer ignore. I moved slowly toward the counter, my purse resting against my side, the weight of the documents inside it feeling heavier than before. The young teller greeted me with a polite smile, but I barely registered her words. Instead, I found myself looking past her, toward the offices along the back wall, where the real conversations happened, the ones that required time and attention and sometimes uncomfortable truths. I would like to speak with someone about my accounts, I said, my voice steady, calm in a way that surprised even me. She nodded and asked me to wait, gesturing toward a row of chairs along the wall. I sat down carefully, folding my hands in my lap, and let the silence settle around me. A few minutes passed before a man stepped out from one of the offices. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a composed expression and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent years listening more than speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, offering a small nod. "I am Thomas Reynolds. Please come with me." His name stirred something faint in my memory, but I could not place it immediately. I followed him into his office, closing the door behind me as he motioned for me to sit. The room was simple, organized, every paper in its place. He sat across from me, folding his hands on the desk, his eyes attentive but not intrusive. "How can I help you today?" he asked. I reached into my purse and placed the folded documents on the desk between us, smoothing them out carefully before sliding them toward him. "I would like to understand what I signed," I said. He glanced down at the papers, his expression shifting slightly, not alarmed but more focused, as if something had just become clearer to him. He adjusted his glasses and began reading, his eyes moving steadily across each line. The room grew very quiet, the only sound the soft turning of paper and the distant murmur of voices outside the office. I watched him, not impatient, not anxious, simply waiting. After a moment, he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at me, his expression measured. "When were these documents signed?" he asked. 2 weeks ago, I replied, "after my husband passed." He nodded slowly, as if that detail confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. "And the transfer was initiated by your son?" I hesitated for just a second, then answered, "Yes." He folded his hands again, considering his words before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore, these documents do transfer a significant portion of your assets into your son's name. However," he paused, his gaze steady, "they do not complete the process in full." I felt something shift inside me at that word. However, it was a small word, but it carried weight. It created space where, just moments ago, there had been none. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. He turned one of the pages toward me, pointing to a section near the bottom, a paragraph I vaguely remembered skimming but not truly reading. "This clause," he explained, "requires a secondary authorization for full control to be established. Without it, the transfer remains conditional." Conditional. I repeated the word silently in my mind, letting it settle, letting it take shape. "And that authorization?" I asked. He met my eyes directly. "It must be completed in person. By you." For the first time since I had stood outside that locked door, something within me steadied completely. Not hope, not relief, something clearer. Understanding. Daniel had moved quickly. Too quickly. He had taken what he thought was everything, assumed the process was complete, assumed I no longer had any claim, any control, any place left to stand. But he had missed something. A detail. A requirement. A step that could not be skipped no matter how certain he had been. I sat there for a moment, absorbing the quiet weight of that realization, the way it shifted the ground beneath everything that had happened. "So the house," I said slowly, "it is not fully his." Mr. Reynolds shook his head slightly. "Not without your final authorization." I nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, as if sealing something in place. "I see," I said. And I did. More clearly than I had seen anything in weeks. Because this was not just about paperwork. It was about assumption. About believing something was finished when it was not. About thinking a door had been closed permanently, when in reality, it had only been left slightly ajar. I gathered the documents carefully, folding them with the same precision I had used earlier, but this time my hands did not feel uncertain. They felt steady, intentional. As I stood to leave, Mr. Reynolds watched me for a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently. If you need assistance moving forward, I would be happy to help. I paused, considering his words, then offered a small nod. Thank you, I replied. I may take you up on that. And as I walked out of the office and back through the quiet hum of the bank, I realized something important. They thought I had been left with nothing. But what they had actually done was give me clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, could be far more powerful than anything I had lost. By the time I stepped outside the bank, the sun had dipped lower, casting long golden lines across the pavement, and for a brief moment, everything looked softer than it really was. I stood there on the sidewalk holding my purse a little closer, not out of fear but out of awareness. The world had not changed. The street was still the same, the people passing by, still wrapped in their own lives, unaware that mine had quietly shifted in a way that could not be undone. I walked slowly toward the parking lot, each step measured, each thought settling into place with a clarity I had not felt in weeks. It was not anger that filled me. It was something steadier, something colder. The kind of understanding that comes when you stop asking why and start seeing how everything fits together. As I reached my car, I paused with my hand on the door handle, my reflection faintly visible in the window. For a moment, I studied the woman looking back at me. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, just as it had been the morning of the funeral. Her posture was still upright, composed, unchanged. But there was something different in her eyes. Not grief, not confusion. Something sharper, something awake. I opened the door and sat down, placing my purse carefully on the passenger seat before resting my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. The silence inside the car felt different from the silence outside my house earlier. This one belonged to me. It did not wait. It did not judge. It simply existed, allowing me to think without interruption. And that is when the memories began to line up in a way they had not before. Not as scattered moments but as a sequence. A pattern. I remembered the first conversation Daniel had after the funeral, how he had sat across from me at the kitchen table, his voice calm, almost rehearsed, explaining how complicated things could become if everything stayed in my name. It is just paperwork, Mom, he had said. It will make everything easier for you. I had nodded, grateful at the time that he was taking initiative, that he was stepping into a role his father once held. I remembered the way Ashley had stood nearby, not saying much but always present, her eyes attentive, her silence somehow louder than words. She had smiled when I agreed, a small, contained smile that I had mistaken for support. Now sitting in my car, that same smile looked different in my memory. Not warm, not kind, calculated. I leaned back slightly, letting out a slow breath as more details surfaced. The urgency. That was the first thing I should have questioned. How quickly everything had been arranged. How the documents had already been prepared, waiting for my signature as if the decision had been made long before I was even aware of it. There had been no discussion, not really. Only explanations. Only reassurance. I thought about the day I signed those papers, the way Daniel had guided me through each page, pointing to where I needed to sign, his tone gentle but firm, keeping things moving, not allowing too much time for hesitation. I had trusted that pace. I had mistaken it for efficiency. Now I saw it for what it truly was. Control. My fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel as another memory surfaced, smaller, quieter, but just as telling. A week before I left town, I had noticed that some of my personal documents were no longer in the drawer where I always kept them. When I asked, Daniel had said he was organizing things, making sure everything was in order. I had thanked him. I had thanked him for removing pieces of my own life without asking. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in regret but in acknowledgement. Because regret implies that I would have done something differently if I had known. And perhaps I would have. But what mattered now was not what I had missed. It was what I understood. I opened my eyes again and looked straight ahead, the road stretching out in front of me, quiet and unassuming. Daniel believed the process was complete. Ashley believed the same. They believed the house was theirs. That I had been reduced to a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And that belief was the foundation of everything they had done. It was also their greatest mistake. I reached for my purse and took out the documents once more, unfolding them with care, my eyes scanning the lines I had barely noticed before. The clause was still there, unchanged, quiet but undeniable. Conditional. That one word carried more weight now than all the others combined. I folded the papers again and placed them back into my purse, this time with a sense of purpose that felt solid, grounded. I was not rushing. I was not reacting. I was preparing, because whatever came next would not be driven by emotion. It would be guided by understanding. I started the car, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum, and eased out of the parking space without hesitation. As I drove away from the bank, merging into the slow flow of traffic, I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that needed revisiting. What mattered now was ahead. Not the house, not the past, but the quiet, deliberate steps that would reshape everything they thought they had secured. And for the first time since I had stood outside that locked door, I did not feel like someone who had been pushed out. I felt like someone who had finally stepped outside on her own terms. I did not drive far. About 10 minutes from the bank, I pulled into a small motel just off the main road. The kind of place people pass without really noticing, with a faded sign and a quiet parking lot that held more silence than activity. It was not where I had imagined I would be at this stage in my life, but it was clean, simple, and most importantly, it was mine for the night. I checked in without hesitation, my voice calm as I gave my name, the clerk barely looking up as he handed me a key attached to a plastic tag with a number printed in bold black. There was something almost comforting about that. No history. No expectations. Just a room and a door that would open when I asked it to. I carried my purse inside, setting it down on the small table by the window before taking a slow look around. A bed neatly made. A chair in the corner. A lamp that cast a soft, steady light. It was not much, but it was enough. I closed the door behind me and locked it, the quiet click echoing in the stillness, and for a brief moment, I stood there with my hand resting on the handle, feeling the difference between being shut out and choosing to close something yourself. That difference mattered more than I had ever realized. I walked over to the bed and sat down, smoothing my hands over the edge of the blanket as if grounding myself in something tangible. The events of the day replayed in my mind, but not as chaos. As structure. Each piece fitting into place with a clarity that removed any lingering doubt. Daniel had not acted alone. That much was obvious now. The precision of it, the timing, the preparation of documents, the quiet removal of my belongings, the change of locks while I was away. These were not impulsive decisions. They were coordinated. And Ashley had been at the center of it. I could see it now in every detail I had once overlooked. The way she redirected conversations. The way she anticipated questions before they were asked. The way she always positioned herself just slightly ahead, guiding the outcome without ever appearing forceful. It was subtle, controlled, effective. I reached for my purse again and took out my phone, not to call Daniel, not to confront him, but to check something simpler. My email. I scrolled through the messages slowly, stopping when I found the one I was looking for. The confirmation of my short trip out of town. The dates. The exact window of time when I had been gone. When the house had been emptied of anything they did not want me to have access to. When the locks had been changed. When the final step of their plan had been completed. It was all there neatly aligned. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly, letting my gaze drift toward the window where the evening light had softened into a muted glow. I did not feel anger. Not the kind that burns quickly and demands an immediate response. What I felt was something far more controlled. A quiet recognition of intent. They had made their move. Now it was my turn to decide mine. I stood up and walked over to the small desk near the wall, pulling out the chair and sitting down with a deliberate sense of purpose. I opened my purse once more and laid the documents out in front of me, smoothing each page carefully, my eyes scanning every line, every clause, every detail I had ignored before. This time I read slowly, thoroughly, not as someone being guided, but as someone who understood the weight of every word. Conditional. The word stood out again, unchanged, steady, waiting. I traced it lightly with my finger, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement. This was where everything shifted. This was where their certainty ended and mine began. I reached for the motel notepad and a pen, the paper crisp and blank beneath my hand. For the first time that day I began to write. Not emotions. Not questions. Facts. Dates. Names. Steps. I wrote down when the documents were signed. When I left town. When I returned. When I discovered the locks had been changed. I wrote down the name of the bank manager, the clause that required my presence, the fact that no final authorization had been given. Each line was precise, controlled, intentional. By the time I finished, the page was filled with a clear sequence, not of what had been done to me, but of what had been overlooked. I set the pen down and looked at what I had written, a quiet sense of clarity settling over me like a calm surface over deep water. They believed they had closed the door completely. They believed I had been left with nothing, but they had not finished what they started. And that was not something I needed to argue. It was something I could use. I gathered the papers again, placing them back into my purse with care before standing and walking back toward the door. I did not open it. I simply rested my hand against it for a moment, feeling the solid certainty of it beneath my palm. This door would open when I chose. Not because someone allowed it, but because I had the key. And as I stepped back into the quiet room, I understood something with absolute clarity. Tomorrow, I would not return as someone asking to be let in. I would return as someone who never truly left. I woke up before the alarm, the room still dim with early morning light filtering through the thin curtains, and for a moment I lay there without moving, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a car passing on the road outside. There was no confusion when I opened my eyes. No disorientation. Just a clear, steady awareness of where I was and what needed to be done. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, and took a moment to straighten the blanket behind me. A small habit I had kept for decades, something that grounded me even now. The reflection in the mirror across the room looked the same as it had the night before, but the feeling behind it had shifted again, settling into something more defined. I was no longer reacting. I was moving forward. I dressed carefully, choosing simple clothes that felt appropriate, neutral, composed, the kind that did not draw attention but did not suggest weakness either. When I finished, I gathered my things, making sure the documents were placed securely in my purse, each page aligned, each detail exactly where it needed to be. I did not rush. There was no reason to. Rushing belonged to them. Precision belonged to me. The morning air outside was cooler than the night before, carrying a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself was pausing before something shifted. I got into my car and sat there for a brief moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, before starting the engine and pulling out onto the road. I did not drive back to the house. Not yet. Instead, I returned to the bank. The same glass doors opened, the same quiet interior greeted me, but this time I did not hesitate. I walked directly to the counter and asked to see Mr. Reynolds again. There was no waiting. When he stepped out and saw me, his expression was calm, as if he had expected this. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, nodding slightly. "Please come in." I followed him into his office once more, closing the door behind me as I took my seat. I did not waste time with explanations. I reached into my purse and placed the documents on his desk again, this time with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. "I would like to move forward," I said simply. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, understanding immediately. "Very well," he replied. He turned to his computer, typing with quiet efficiency, occasionally glancing at the documents, confirming details, aligning everything that had been left incomplete. The process was not rushed. It was deliberate, each step explained clearly, each action requiring my acknowledgement. This time I read everything. Every line. Every condition. Every implication. I asked questions where I needed clarity, not because I doubted, but because I intended to understand fully. Mr. Reynolds answered each one with the same measured tone, never assuming, never simplifying beyond what was necessary. When the moment came, he turned the final page toward me, indicating the space where my signature would complete what had been left unfinished. "This will finalize the transfer," he said. "Under your terms." Under my terms. The phrase settled in quietly, carrying a weight that felt both firm and undeniable. I picked up the pen, holding it for a brief second, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was the moment they had assumed I would never reach. The step they believed had already been taken. The control they thought they had secured. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, each letter clear, precise, unmistakable. When I finished, I set the pen down and slid the document back toward him. He reviewed it, then nodded once, confirming what had just been done. It is complete, he said. There was no dramatic shift in the room, no sudden change in the air. But something had been set into motion, something that could not be undone by assumption or silence. Mr. Reynolds made a few final entries, printed a confirmation, and handed me a copy of the completed authorization. I accepted it, folding it carefully before placing it into my purse. What happens now? I asked. He met my eyes directly. Now, he said, your son will be notified of the finalized status, and any actions taken under the assumption of full ownership will need to be addressed accordingly. I nodded once, understanding exactly what that meant without needing further explanation. I stood, smoothing my jacket slightly, and offered a small, composed smile. Thank you, I said. You have been very helpful. Of course, he replied. If you need anything further, do not hesitate to reach out. I turned and walked out of the office through the quiet bank and back into the morning light. This time, as I stepped outside, there was no uncertainty in my movements, no lingering questions. The road ahead was clear. I got into my car and started the engine, my hand steady on the wheel as I pulled out onto the street. Only then did I turn toward the direction of the house, not as someone returning to ask for access, not as someone hoping for explanation, but as someone who understood exactly what had been done, what had been missed, and what would happen next. I did not rush as I drove back. The road looked the same as it had the day before, the same houses, the same quiet intersections, the same people moving through their routines without noticing anything unusual. But to me, everything had shifted. Not on the outside, on the inside. I turned onto my street slowly, the tires rolling over the familiar pavement, each house passing by like a memory I had already filed away. When I reached the driveway, I did not pull in right away. I parked along the curb instead, leaving a small, deliberate distance between myself and the house. It was not hesitation. It was control. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently, the sound soft but clear in the still morning air. The house stood exactly as it had the day before, unchanged, composed, almost indifferent. Curtains drawn. Door closed. The same quiet front yard with flowers I had planted myself, now blooming without me. I walked up the path slowly, my step steady, my posture upright, my expression calm. There was no anger in my face. No urgency. Just presence. When I reached the front door, I did not take out the key. I did not knock immediately. Instead, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle again. But this time it felt different. This silence did not hold power over me anymore. Simply existed. I raised my hand and knocked once. Firm. Clear. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just enough. I waited. A few seconds passed, and then I heard movement inside. Footsteps. Slow at first, then closer. The faint sound of something being set down. The pause of someone deciding how to respond. Then the lock clicked. The door opened just slightly, and Daniel stood there, his expression guarded, his posture stiff. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. He looked at me as if trying to measure something, trying to understand what had changed, what he might have missed. "Mom," he said finally, his voice uncertain, not warm, not cold, just unsure. I met his gaze without flinching. "Daniel," I replied, my tone even controlled. He opened the door a little wider but did not step aside. He did not invite me in. That detail did not escape me. It confirmed everything without a single word needing to be spoken. "You should have called," he said, shifting slightly, his eyes searching mine for something he could use. "We were going to talk." I nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "I am sure you were," I said. There was a brief pause. The air between us felt thin, stretched, as if it could snap with the wrong movement. Behind him, I could see part of the living room, familiar furniture arranged in the same way, but something about it felt distant now, like looking into a place that no longer recognized me. "We made some changes while you were away," he continued, his tone becoming more controlled, more rehearsed. "It is better this way. Less stress for you." I listened without interrupting, letting him finish, letting him build whatever explanation he believed would hold. When he stopped, I reached into my purse slowly, my movements deliberate, and took out the folded document. I did not rush. I unfolded it carefully and held it between us, not pushing it forward yet, just letting it exist in the space. His eyes dropped to the paper for a fraction of a second, then returned to my face, uncertainty now more visible. "What is that?" he asked. I took a small step closer, not aggressive, not forceful, just enough to close the distance that had been placed between us. "This," I said calmly, "is the part you missed." I handed the document to him, my fingers releasing it without hesitation. He took it, his brow tightening slightly as he began to read. I watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Each second that passed, his expression shifted. The certainty that had been there before began to fade, replaced by something less stable, something more uncertain. His grip on the paper tightened just slightly. "What is this?" he asked again, but this time his voice had changed. It was no longer controlled. It carried the edge of something he had not expected. "It is the final authorization," I replied. "The one that had not been completed." He looked back down at the document, scanning it more carefully now, his movements quicker, less composed. "You said everything was done," I added quietly. "It was not." There was a long pause, the kind that does not need to be filled. Behind him I noticed movement. Ashley appeared just inside the hallway, her expression sharp, her eyes immediately locking onto the paper in Daniel's hands. She did not speak right away, but her presence changed the air, tightening it, focusing it. Daniel looked up at me again. Something unsettled now clearly visible beneath the surface. "You went to the bank," he said. It was not a question. I nodded once. "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. He stepped back slightly, not fully opening the door, but no longer blocking it entirely either. It was a small shift, but it was enough. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, more reactive. I met his gaze steadily, my posture unchanged. "We will," I replied, "but not the way you planned." And for the first time since I had stood outside that door with a key that no longer worked, I could see it clearly. The balance had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. Daniel stepped back just enough for the door to open wider, and this time, he did not stop me as I crossed the threshold. I walked inside slowly, not as someone returning home, but as someone entering a space that had been rearranged without her permission. The air felt the same, faintly scented with the lemon polish I used to keep under the sink, but something deeper had shifted. Ownership is not just about walls and furniture. It is about presence, and mine had been deliberately removed. I stood in the entryway for a moment, taking in the details. A new rug I had never seen before. The side table moved slightly to the left. A stack of mail placed neatly where I used to sort it every morning. Small changes but intentional ones. Daniel closed the door behind me, the sound quieter than before, almost cautious. Ashley stepped forward now, her posture composed, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes were sharper, more alert than they had been in weeks past. "Margaret," she said, her voice smooth, measured, "we did not expect you today." I turned slightly to face her, my expression calm. "That seems to be a pattern," I replied. There was a brief pause, just enough for the meaning to settle. Daniel glanced between us, shifting his weight as if trying to regain control of a situation that was no longer responding to him the way it had before. He looked down again at the document in his hand, reading it more carefully now, as if hoping the words would change the second time. "This does not make sense," he said, his voice tighter than before. "Everything was already transferred." I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement but in correction. "Everything you understood was transferred," I said. "Not everything that was required." Ashley stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the paper. "Let me see that," she said, extending her hand. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing it to her. She scanned it quickly, her eyes moving faster than his had, but her expression gave more away. The confidence that had defined her before was no longer fully intact. It had not disappeared, but it had shifted. "This is just a technicality," she said after a moment, her tone firm, almost dismissive. "It does not change the overall structure." I watched her carefully, noting not just what she said but how she said it. The slight tension in her jaw. The way her fingers held the paper a little too tightly. "It changes everything," I replied quietly. She looked up at me then, her gaze direct, measuring. You signed those documents, she said. You agreed to the transfer. I did, I said. And I also completed what was left unfinished. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that settles into the room and makes itself impossible to ignore. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. His movements less controlled now, more reactive. Why would you do that without talking to us? He asked, his voice carrying a note of frustration that had not been there before. I met his gaze steadily. You made your decisions without talking to me, I said. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the response he had prepared no longer fitting the situation. Ashley stepped in again, her tone shifting, softer now, more calculated. Margaret, she said. We were trying to make things easier for you. You have been through a lot. This house is a lot to manage on your own. I listened, letting her words settle without interrupting. When she finished, I took a small step forward, my voice still even, still calm. Then why change the locks while I was away? I asked. The question landed cleanly, without force but with precision. For a moment, neither of them answered. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was no longer something they controlled. It belonged to the truth that had just been spoken aloud. Daniel looked at Ashley briefly, then back at me, his expression unsettled. We thought it would be better if we handled things ahead of time, he said, but the words lacked the certainty they once had. You thought it would be easier if I did not have a choice, I replied. Ashley's expression tightened slightly, but she did not respond immediately. She was recalculating, adjusting. That was what she did. But this time the variables had changed. This does not have to be complicated, she said finally. We can still work this out. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. It is already complicated, I said. You just did not realize it yet. Daniel looked down at the document again, then back at me, his voice quieter now. So what happens now? He asked. I held his gaze, my posture steady, my tone unchanged. Now, I said, everything moves according to what was actually completed, not what you assumed. Another silence followed, heavier this time, filled with the weight of something neither of them had prepared for. And as I stood there in the house I had built, in the space they had tried to remove me from, I understood something with complete clarity. They had planned for control. They had planned for certainty. They had not planned for correction. And that was where everything began to unravel. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said. He stood there, the document still in his hand, as if it had gained weight, as if it now carried something he could no longer ignore or dismiss. Ashley, however, recovered first. She always did. I watched it happen in real time, the shift in her posture, the recalibration behind her eyes, the careful adjustment of tone that followed. Let us not make this bigger than it needs to be, she said, her voice smooth again, controlled, as if the last few minutes had not unsettled her at all. We are family. We can figure this out without turning it into something unnecessary. I held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. You already turned it into something, I said quietly. I am just responding to it. The room fell still again, but this time it was not tense. It was clear. Daniel looked between us, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization, as if the version of events he had been holding on to was beginning to fracture. Mom, he said softer now, we were trying to help. You cannot manage all of this on your own. It is too much. I let his words settle before responding, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to hear the difference in what I was about to say. Managing something, I replied, and losing it are not the same thing. He looked down briefly, his grip on the paper loosening slightly. Ashley stepped forward again, but this time her approach was different. Less assertive. More measured. What do you want, Margaret? She asked. It was a simple question, but it carried more weight than anything else that had been said. I considered it for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to choose the words carefully. I want clarity, I said. Not promises. Not explanations. Clarity. She studied me, her expression unreadable for a brief second, before she nodded slightly. And what does that look like to you? She asked. I took a slow breath, my posture unchanged, my voice steady. It looks like acknowledging that what was done without my consent, I said. It looks like recognizing that the process you relied on was not complete. And it looks like understanding that from this point forward, decisions will not be made around me. They will be made with me or not at all. Daniel shifted slightly, as if the ground beneath him had changed and he was still adjusting to the new footing. So you are saying, he began but stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. I am saying, I continued, that nothing you assumed is final. Ashley's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger but in focus. And the house? She asked. What about it? I met her gaze directly. The house remains under my authority until everything is properly resolved, I said. That is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of record. Another pause. Longer now. Heavier. The kind that forces everything into the open whether anyone is ready or not. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as if trying to steady himself. We did not think it would go this way, he said quietly. I nodded once. I know, I replied. Ashley held the document for a moment longer before placing it carefully on the table beside her, as if setting something down that could no longer be ignored. Then we will need to reassess, she said, her tone more neutral now, less controlled, more cautious. I inclined my head slightly. That would be wise, I said. I turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet sense of finality, and walked toward the door. Neither of them stopped me this time. Neither of them spoke. I reached for the handle, pausing for just a fraction of a second before opening it and stepping outside. The air felt different again, but not because anything around me had changed. It was because I had. I walked down the path slowly, the same one I had walked so many times before, but this time I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that needed confirmation. Everything that mattered had already been made clear. As I reached the curb, I stopped briefly, letting my eyes rest on the house one last time. Not with attachment, not with regret, but with understanding. I had not lost it. Not in the way they believed. What I had lost was something else entirely. The assumption that family always meant protection. The belief that trust would be returned in equal measure. And as I stood there, the morning light settling softly across the street, I realized something that felt both simple and absolute. A house can be taken, transferred, even locked. But dignity is something no one can claim unless you hand it to them. And I had just taken mine back.